Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. One of the shortest, and perhaps on a, what would we call it, paradoxical level, most convoluted of Franz Kafka's short stories, is the one that is titled On Parables, in German, von den Gleichnissen. And we'll talk about what that term means in just a bit. Parables is okay, but might be a little bit restrictive. And it runs like this. So we're going to go through it and then we'll comment on it and unpack it. Many complain that the words of the wise are already merely parables and of no use in daily life, which is the only life we have. When the sage says, "Go over," he does not mean that we should cross to some actual place, which we could do anyhow if the labor were worth it. He means some fabulous yonder, something unknown to us, something he cannot designate more precisely either, and therefore cannot help us here in the very least. All these parables really set out to say merely that the incomprehensible is incomprehensible, and we know that already, but the cares we have to struggle with every day, that is a different matter. Concerning this, a man once said, "Why such reluctance? If you only followed the parables, you yourselves would become parables, and with that get rid of all your daily cares." Another said, "I bet that also is a parable." The first said, "You have won." The second said, "But unfortunately only in parable." The first said, "No, in reality, in parable, you have lost." So what do we have here? A discussion with an illustrative parable, a metaparable, if you wish, a parable illustrating how parables work, how to evaluate them, and we'll come to that in just a moment. So we begin with the first line. Many complain. And part of what's going on here, these are very good translations of Kafka, but every translation loses something, and it's important to go back to the original to get a fuller sense. So complain, beklagen sich, it could be mourning as well, lamenting. Many are upset and express this in language, that the words of the wise are the things that the wise people have to say to us, presumably people who know more than us about life. The words of the wise are only parables, Gleichnisse. Now, this is coming from a word gleich, which means equivalence or identity or equality. And there's another term that gets used a lot that this is not Gleichheit. So like if we say there's an equation and this equals this, that's a Gleichheit. This is something different, Gleichnis. This is a likening. This is things being made similar to each other. And you could say, if we want a very broad sense, a metaphor, right? A parable is an extended metaphor. Now, parables is just fine, because if you think about the parables in the Gospels when Jesus is saying, the kingdom of faith is like this, or this is like this, those are parables. Those are stories that tell us something. You should think about these people. There are 3 of them, and then these things happen to them. So that's a story. Allegory is another term that sometimes Gleichnis will translate. So parables, the words of the wise, the things that they seem to be saying to us in a literal, helpful for us way, turn out not to be so. Why? Because they are merely parables of no use, unverwendbar. So verwenden is to make use of something, literally to, turn it to use, right? We're not able, they sound great, these things that the words of the wise, ring out to us, but we can't quite figure out what to do with them. If we take them at a literal level, they often get us in trouble, as we're going to see. Why? They're no use to us in our daily life. Why not? Well, he gives an example. So the wise person says, go over, go somewhere else, move from this place to another place. And he says it's not some actual place that you're being told to go to. Like if somebody says, I need to get a set of keys made. Well, you need to go to the locksmith, and there's one of them over on this avenue here. I can recommend him. You're like, oh, okay, I'll get up my little map. I see where I'm supposed to go. Or, you're like, I'm hungry. Well, you need to go to the grocery store and buy yourself some groceries and bring them back here and cook them up. Or you can go to a restaurant. These are very practical concerns, and they have to do with actual locations. The wise say, go to this place. Go to this thing. We can think of the biblical parables, right? You want to get into the kingdom of heaven, don't you? Well, where the hell is that? So maybe that's a parable. And Kafka has, people saying, that's some fabulous yonder, some over there. And we're not quite sure where the where is. And he says, this is something unknown to us. Was wir nicht kennen. Something we're not actually acquainted with. We don't know where to find this thing that is being referenced, this place that's being referenced, this condition. So what do we have? He tells us that the wise have something they cannot designate more precisely either. So designate, bezeichnen, something that they can't indicate. They just have this vague thing. More precisely, nicht näher. You can't actually get closer in real geography terms, in spatiality, to what it is that they're talking about. And so this is something that cannot help us here at all. Gar nichts helfen kann. Right? Gar nichts, not at all. In no way whatsoever. So we got this interesting contrast here, right? The words of the wise, they are parables, they are metaphors, and they designate something over here which is kind of indistinct. As soon as we get close to it, it recedes from us, and then we've got our real life over here, and so this stuff can't actually help us in any way, in any real way. Could it help us in other ways? Well, that's kind of left open. Maybe it gives us hope. Maybe it consoles us. That's not what this discussion says, though. So then Kafka goes on and he says, all they actually set out to say, all they wollen sagen, all they really want to say, all they want to express is that the incomprehensible, unfassbare, is incomprehensible, and we already knew that. It's basically what in logic we call a tautology. Things that are incomprehensible, yes, they are indeed incomprehensible. Now, unfassbare, it could be incomprehensible, literally things that we can't get a hold of, right? Sometimes we have this metaphor of something we can wrap our head around or wrap our mind around. That's sort of what he's talking about. You ask somebody, okay, well, what is this thing that the wise is talking about? And you're like, yeah, I think I knew it before, but now I can't explain it to you. The parables show us that. Is that not something useful? I mean, what if we were taking things that are abstractions as if they are realities, maybe parables, by showing us that that's the case, actually help us out? But again, Kafka doesn't say that. There's a very strong distinction here between airy-fairy, wise people stuff, and then, pragmatic, humdrum daily stuff over here, real, ideal, and they don't really mix. He says then, all the cares that we struggle with, abmühen, right? All the things that we have to deal with every single day, those are something else, or better translated, other matters, andere Dinge, in the plural. Not just a separate thing or a different thing, but different things. Our life is full of different things. So telling us that the incomprehensible is incomprehensible, that sounds profound, but it doesn't really help us out. It doesn't balance our budget. It doesn't get us fed. It doesn't get us work. It doesn't help us with our relationships or anything that we could think of. Then he's going to go into a metaparable that we were talking about. And this really bears some scrutiny. So we've got two people talking to each other. This is supposed to be itself a gleichnis that is going to tell us something about how we should deal with parables. So the first person says, why such reluctance? Why are you on your guard against parables? So this is somebody responding to those who complain about all of this. Somebody who's taking a different position. And he outlines a possibility that itself seems unrealistic. If you followed parables, you yourself would transform into parables. Now, what could that possibly mean for a human being to become a parable, to become a metaphor, to become an allegory? Well, there's a lot of different ways we could go with this, right? And we could stop and think about this quite a bit. Interestingly, these people are themselves, they're not real to us. They are kind of parables, or at least they're within a parable. So this person is referencing in language precisely what Kafka has these two speakers doing. But for the rest of us, we have bodies, we have histories. Can we become parables? Perhaps only when we're gone from the scene, but still remembered or memorialized in writing or speaking or, graphic arts or something like that. So if we followed parables, we could become parables. And then notice the promise here. And be free of your daily cares. Mühe frei, right? Of the things that, we've been saying parables don't help us out with. The words of the wise don't help us out with our daily cares and conditions and concerns. But this could make you free of them. Well, that's interesting. How would that happen? Again, no indication. So, the next person, person B, says, or the second person in the parable, I bet that's a parable, right? So they are using language to explain that this use of language is the sort of thing that they have been talking about. There's a lot of meta levels going on here. And this is meta language as well. That's a parable. What you just said, other speaker. And he says, I bet that's a parable. I wager that's a parable. And then we get to this language of winning and losing. And usually when we think about winning a bet, there's some sort of, money or prize attached. I'll bet you this amount of money that something is the case or something will be the case. Oop, look, I got my lucky, number. You pay me, right? There's no mention of what's being wagered here. I bet that's a parable. You have won, is what the other person says, the bet. You are correct. That is a parable. I am giving you a parable about following parables, becoming parables, being free of your daily cares. So I'm giving you sort of words of the wise here, is what person 1 or person A is saying. And then person B gets something wrong. He says, he's trying to be clever, we could assume, right? And he says, but only in parable. I've only won in parable. And person one says, oh, no. You actually won in reality. You are correct. My use of language here about parables is itself another parable. That's true. That's in Wirklichkeit. But, and here's where it gets really interesting. In parable, you have lost. So you won in the realm of our daily cares, our activities, but you lost the move, the game, whatever it happens to be, in this higher level of Gleichnisse, parables, comparisons, metaphors. You're not as good at this, we could say. But we don't actually have, we could go a lot of different ways of interpretation with this, but we don't really know what any of them are going to be. And so we're dealing with some sort of, fabulous yonder, you could say, if we want to invoke the earlier discussion, something that's unknown to us, something we can't completely designate. What is it to lose in parable? We don't really know. And so there's a lot to think about with this, and Kafka leaves it open to you, the reader, to think about this. He gives you something almost like a maze or a labyrinth of words that have to do with the relation between parables and real life. So there isn't a solution to this in the sense that we can say, this is exactly what is meant, and that's part of the paradox that Kafka has articulated for us.